In 1971, America declared war.
America's public enemy number one in the United States is drug abuse.
Richard Nixon launched the war on drugs.
In order to fight and defeat this enemy, it is necessary to wage a new all-out offensive.
New Zealand joined the war on drugs a few years later, and our legislation to combat drug harm is still anchored in that era, with the Misuse of Drugs Act 1975.
I think New Zealanders might be a little bit disturbed to think we have Richard Nixon's legislation in place to govern our drug policy today in 2022.
In the early 1970s, New Zealand's counterculture was just beginning. Following the lead of Britain and America, people were experimenting with art and music and drugs.
There were decades prior to that where New Zealand had a fairly available supply on prescription of heroin, cannabis. We also had access to cocaine and amphetamines actually. At one point, because the US was driving this war on drugs approach, the United Nations wrote to New Zealand and said, can you please stop prescribing so much heroin?
It turns out that most of what we were told about drugs 50 years ago was wrong, or at least not guided by the facts.
We've legislated certain types of drugs in certain ways because of history and prejudice, not because of science and evidence.
The science says the drug that causes the most harm is the one that's sold at bottle stores and supermarkets and sponsors the local sports team. And the drugs that do the least harm, both to the user and to society, psychedelics like LSD and mushrooms, are Class A drugs in New Zealand. If you supply a Class A drug to others, you could be sentenced to prison for life. Even possessing them can land you 6 months in jail. Ecstasy is also near the bottom of the harm scale to the user, but it's a Class B drug, and the police spend a lot of time and money trying to keep it off the street.
There's still a strong market for our organised criminal groups to tap into there. They're still making significant profits, so we still need to understand that environment. We still need to have a really good understanding around what some people would see as less harmful drugs.
With cannabis, if you try to spare your lungs by eating it rather than smoking it, it's actually judged a more dangerous drug.
Cannabis is Class C, which kind of makes sense, but if cannabis is formed into an oil or made into some sort of biscuit or edible, it becomes Class B.
Who's setting these rules? Who decide?
1975 decides. I mean, it's really bizarre.
But increasingly, the international community, including parts of Australia, are realising this is not a war they can win.
I think we can all look at the evidence and see the war on drugs in the way that it has been fought and expressed has not been successful. Making drug use a criminal offence and making the possession of small amounts of drugs a criminal offence doesn't stop people using drugs and doesn't stop people possessing those small amounts of drugs for personal use.
So why is New Zealand still fighting?
The money is the driver. Supply is fed by the desire to make money, and there is a demand for the product. While there's demand, you will never beat the economy.
Do you ever think if it wasn't illegal, then the money would disappear from it and you wouldn't have to be doing this?
I don't think you will ever remove the organised crime element from the murky world of drugs.
But what is the collateral damage? How much harm are we doing by prosecuting people for drug use?
It all started when my mum passed away. That's when I got into it hard out.
Were you pretty close to your mum?
Yeah, she brought me up when I was 3 weeks old. Yeah, so she was my final mum.
So what was the point where you thought, this is getting away on me, you know? This is leading me to a place I don't want to be?
No, it was jail.
It was jail?
Yeah.
When you think about it, nearly all of us are drug users, and just about every human society throughout the ages has used some form of intoxicating substance. Jo Leach is the daughter of a police officer. Her teenage partying and experimenting with drugs ramped up after her dad left. She ended up on meth, and the addiction, the drug laws and the stigma created a black hole that was hard to escape from.
As you use more, you need more. And that cycle, you know, like, so you're up to $1,000 a day before you know it. And because I was using, I couldn't maintain a job. So therefore I was unemployed, and I turned to crime and selling to support being able to fund my habit.
There are massive health problems with meth, we know that. But there's a big side of it that is just compounded by the criminal aspect to it, right? Mm-hmm. It shuts you out.
Yes.
Doesn't it?
It marginalises you, you know, like it's, you're separated from the rest of society, really, you know? So there's a saying that secrets keep you sick, you know, and that perpetuates that because you're having to be so separate from society and not let people know. And that also raises barriers to reach out for help.
You had a pretty extensive criminal record.
Yes, I do, yes.
Yeah.
12 pages.
12 pages?
Yes.
So, like 100 and something?
Yeah, I think it's about either 160 or 180.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah. And that means that, you know, you're filling out a job application or, you know, there's
doesn't look good.
No, it's not brilliant, is it?
No, it's not.
It's not like your LinkedIn profile, is it?
No. It might be now. No.
We'll come back to see how on earth Jo might have turned this into a positive later on. But first, she has a theory on why people use drugs. She reckons it's either numbing pain or seeking pleasure.
Because I know when I started, it was both. You know, it was fun. I was doing it with my friends. I just took it a little bit further than the rest of them. So if drugs were unpleasant, we wouldn't be doing them. You know, they become unpleasant, but usually at the start, we're doing it to feel good and to numb pain, so.
If we're talking about taking drugs to numb pain, it's hard to find a better example than Aaron. Sitting down and listening to him makes you wonder how you might have fared in his shoes.
Not knowing my parents is the hardest part. I got adopted out when I was 6 months old. I was state ward A.
Oh, you were state ward?
Yeah, 1969. I was just a survivor. Didn't know nothing else except for drugs and alcohol and homelessness.
Aaron says he began sniffing petrol at aged 7. He left school at 13 and his drug use soon led to trouble with the law.
I was getting custody for a roach and for some weed.
So are you saying you got convicted for just having a small amount of cannabis?
Yep.
You got prosecuted?
Prosecuted.
Not jailed, though.
I did for one time.
You got jailed for having cannabis?
Yeah. Like it wasn't a supply charge. It was just personal use.
But there are pockets of New Zealand where the police are conceding that the war on drugs approach is not working.
What we know is that we're not going to arrest our way out of this.
In Whangarei, police are treating meth use as a health issue rather than a criminal one, using a program called Te Ara Oranga, or the Path to Wellbeing. Instead of charging meth users with possession of the Class A drug, police are referring them to health and rehab services. The program results in a 34% drop in criminal offending by those who take part, and they tend to see the police in a different light.
I can tell you that my clients every day say that police officer has saved my life. It's funny because the police officers, when I tell them that, they go, really? But it's true. They'll go, wow, and they can name the constable or detective, how the day that they offered them a referral to Te Aotearoa as opposed to, charging them or whatever. Almost like they feel special, like, why me? They picked me.
Te Aotearoa is special and successful. After more than 3,000 people in Northland were helped by the program, it's now being rolled out in towns in the Eastern Bay of Plenty. But these areas are exceptions. Mostly, New Zealand is still following the path of fighting the war on drugs, trying to destroy the sources of supply. Customs Intelligence Chief Bruce Berry has been battling the drug trade for 30 years, but he says the volumes keep rising.
Organised crime is really targeting New Zealand in bulk supply. What we're seeing is a model that's been replicated all around the world, and it's a model that works. That's why they've transplanted it here.
Berry says that in the 1990s it was a big deal to seize 1 kilo of drugs being smuggled into New Zealand.
I think you intercepted 613 kilograms of methamphetamine in March of 2022.
Yeah, and that was one interception. In 2021, Customs seized over 1.6 tonnes of drugs. We're already exceeding that. We expect to be over 2 tonnes of drugs for 2022.
What's going on?
The money's there, they're pushing the drugs.
That means new business models and novel drug smuggling tactics.
We've seen it mixed with things such as concrete, where it's then extracted through an extraction process. Simple things like impregnation in clothing and books. Things that we've seen and heard about for many years internationally are now with us. If you can think it, it's been done.
And when you think about it, if we were winning the war on drugs, then wouldn't drugs like meth be hard to get? In Whangarei and other towns in the north of Aotearoa, that's simply not true.
Is it easy to get it?
Well, yeah. Probably every second nurse you go to is and they have meth instead of anything else. Eh? Normally they have tinny houses. You just go to any house and then you'll find meth more than you'll do find dope these days.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Tim McKinnell wanted to be a cop from the age of 18, but he was told he needed more life experience. He got a bit of that and he signed up.
So I was recruited to join the police in Dunedin, and that was late 1996, and by January 97 I was a fresh-faced police officer in South Auckland. I was pretty naive. I came from a relatively small town, a pretty conservative Catholic family, and 4 years in Dunedin isn't really life experience to prepare you for working on the streets in South Auckland. So it was daunting, it was fascinating, it was interesting, and I thoroughly enjoyed it.
After a couple of years as a detective in South Auckland, Tim McKinnell joined the drug squad in the early 2000s, focusing on MDMA, meth and cannabis.
It was pretty easy to find out where these tinny houses were. They would pop up pretty quickly, and they would do a roaring trade, and so it wouldn't take much in the way of observation to work out what was going on. You'd get a search warrant, you'd put together your intelligence, and you go in and you'd kick in some doors.
At the time, McKinnell felt he was making a difference, but then the drug squad detective began studying for a master's degree in criminology, and the more he learned, the more he began to doubt himself.
To begin with, it was quite confronting. So you start to read evidence that drug enforcement is ineffectual, makes no difference, and so that's difficult to deal with, and in the beginning I didn't accept it. But as you read more and you begin to understand how the drug markets work and how the black market works, the prevalence of drug use and supply in wider society has persisted over decades. It forces you to think about whether the policies that we have, the enforcement that we have, is working at all.
And is it?
I believe that the war on drugs has been a complete and utter failure. That is not to say that I think a widespread drug use is a good thing, but criminalising communities, generally communities that in poverty, has failed us. I think there are a whole lot of harms that come with making criminals of people that use and socially deal drugs.
The trouble is, those at the front line of the war on drugs often don't know what the war is actually about.
I never, when I was on Drug Squad, certainly in the beginning, understood the history of prohibition, how it came about, what the motives were, and how we slipped in behind the American system. And it was only as I was coming towards the end of my police career I started to read and understand that sort of thing. And that's crazy. If you're going into a particular area of policing, you've got a whole lot of powers and resources. I think you have a responsibility, you should have a responsibility to understand the background and the history to what it is you're doing.
He now thinks our current drug laws are pointless.
I think criminalising people who use drugs is a lost cause. If you think about the extent of drug use in New Zealand, somewhere between 50 and 80% of all New Zealanders have in their lifetime used drugs. Do I personally think 50 to 80% of all New Zealanders should be convicted criminals? Absolutely not. I think it's pretty clear that the law is wrong.
In 2016, the Drug Harm Index estimated that New Zealand spends about $350 million a year on drug interventions. Of that, 170 million was on courts and prisons, 100 million was on policing, and just 80 million was for healthcare. Customs spends tens of millions every year trying to stop illicit drugs entering the country. It employs more than 1,500 staff and says all of those people have a role in combating drugs. And not only their people.
He's narcotics, cash and firearms trained.
Zion is a 5-year-old lab retriever cross.
He's mainly trained on Class A and B drugs, so powders, pills, crystals.
If Zion sniffs out the stash, he signals his find by sitting down.
Good boy.
And he gets his reward. This lace from India has bags of dirty meth stashed inside the packaging.
Just looking at it, probably get just under 600 grams.
That's a lot of meth that won't be sold on the street, but there's plenty more where that came from. What do we got here, do you think?
So this one's out of India. It's 2 little bits of cardboard stuck together. I'm guessing a cheap shop display is what it's meant to look like. And within the sheets of card, we've got a small pouch here. The feel of it is quite crystalline.
This one is a major haul, maybe $120,000 worth. So it's going to be a pretty big haul in there, isn't it?
Yeah, it's going to be a pretty big one. Good thing I'm finishing late today.
But while Customs checks packages at Auckland Airport, across town there's a different type of drug checking going on.
We get people bringing in things like MDMA, LSD, ketamine, methamphetamine, and we generally find that there's around about 30-ish% of stuff that isn't what people think it is.
This is a drug checking station. These clinics are run by the Drug Foundation and Know Your Stuff. They pop up every couple of weeks in towns around New Zealand and also at music festivals and major events. Drug checking is legal now after a law change in 2021, one of the few areas where New Zealand is taking a harm reduction approach to drugs. This is strictly about health and science. The information cannot be used in criminal evidence.
So people can feel very confident that when they come here to get their drugs checked, it's just good quality information that's coming back to them and no fear of prosecution.
This is the harm reduction approach at work. The idea that some people are always going to take drugs, so they might as well take them safely.
Most of the time, people that come in here, it might be their first conversation that they've had about drug use. To be able to talk that through, talk about safer ways of using it, things like spacing it out so you're not doing it every weekend, leaving it for months in between, things like not mixing it with other medications, like prescription medications and stuff like that. Those kind of conversations are really, really important to help people prevent problems, and that's something that has been completely invisible in the way that we have traditionally dealt with drugs, where we turn a blind eye to everything and say don't do them until issues are terrible and somebody has contact with the health and justice system.
It may also have created a cleaner drug supply in New Zealand because for the first time the consumer has some power.
We also have this interesting phenomenon starting to happen of the consumer going back to the person they purchased from and saying, hang on, this isn't what we thought it was.
There is a dark humour in the idea that drug dealers might actually be held accountable for the quality of their product. But of course, this can be a life and death issue.
Police have issued an urgent warning and are racing to find the source of
In mid-2022, a dozen people in the Wairarapa region who thought they were consuming cocaine ended up in hospital. The drugs they'd been sold actually contained fentanyl, a synthetic opioid 50 times stronger than heroin. The National Drug Intelligence Bureau is fully on board with the drug checking program.
If they can take their substances along, have them checked, confirmed that they are what they believed they were, then we're really happy about that, because we know we'll see less harm, less death in our community.
But New Zealand still locks people up just for taking drugs. Last year, about 3,100 people were convicted for low-level drug crimes like possession and personal use. Of those, about half were Māori. In the last 10 years, 35,000 New Zealanders have been convicted of a cannabis offence, and 5,500 have been sent to prison. And this hardline approach has long had political support.
I believe any measures are justified, and if they don't work, then we'll bring in harder penalties and other methods.
This is not your Woodstock weed or your parents' pot.
1,000 years will pass before I ever vote yes.
I will be voting against the legalisation of cannabis.
When we talk about the failure of the war on drugs, I just don't accept that. It's not a war that's been lost, it's an ongoing war. It doesn't mean we throw up our hands and say it's too difficult and we're just going to turn this into a health issue now.
New Zealand came close to major drug reform in 2020, but the referendum to legalise cannabis narrowly failed. Portugal decriminalised all drugs more than 20 years ago now, and the model has spread to other countries, including Canada and parts of America and Australia.
Not only are we arresting thousands of New Zealanders still every year for essentially possession of a substance that they're using themselves, we are also preventing people from seeking help.
New Zealand doesn't usually look to Australia for progressive social reform, but the Australian Capital Territory has moved well ahead of us. In Canberra, it's legal to smoke cannabis at home and to grow up to 4 cannabis plants per household.
There is no penalty, as you say, for smoking cannabis in your own home, for growing a couple of plants, for the possession of up to 50 grams of cannabis. There is no fine and no penalty associated with that activity.
Health Minister Rachel Stephen-Smith says there was no uptick in cannabis use or harm, and now the state is set to decriminalise 11 other drugs.
Treating personal drug use as a health issue rather than as a criminal one.
And what drugs would it cover?
MDMA, LSD, psilocybin or magic mushrooms, heroin, cocaine and methamphetamine, as well as we've got a slightly separate regime for cannabis, but it also is included in this particular bill.
Get caught with small amounts of these drugs and it's a $100 fine, not jail time.
Because we know that one of the significant harms associated with illicit drug use, as well as the health harms, is the criminalisation of people, and that comes from being engaged in the criminal justice system, but also the stigma associated with that, and the reluctance maybe to seek treatment, to seek support.
In New Zealand, keeping someone in prison costs about $150,000 a year. The ACT's health minister aims to reduce that kind of cost to her state and to reduce the harm to drug users.
We're seeing more people accessing health services, both for drug treatment and support. And of course, you know, the big benefit of it is fewer people engaged in the criminal justice system. So people not ending up using the court's resources, potentially ending up in detention purely as a result of their own drug use.
Polling shows that there's support for a similar approach in New Zealand. But how would that work with what the drug intelligence bosses say is our most harmful illegal drug?
Cannabis, I believe, would be the most prevalent drug in New Zealand. But if we're talking about a drug that's causing significant social harm in New Zealand, I think methamphetamine is our #1 drug of concern.
New Zealanders consume about 16 kilograms of meth each week, and it's costing us in many ways.
That's around $8.5 million that's coming out of our communities each and every week just for methamphetamine.
We pay top dollar for drugs. A kilo of refined meth that fetches $5,000 in the US has a street value of about $160,000 in New Zealand.
In other words, this is a good place to sell meth.
Correct. So New Zealanders pay the third highest prices in the world for methamphetamine, only behind Australia and Japan. So when we're talking about pricing, we're very, very attractive.
So this is a lucrative market for meth?
Very much so.
One of the things the Drug Intelligence Bureau does is run a wastewater testing system, so Blair McDonald knows which towns are taking which drugs. Aucklanders are the biggest cocaine users, and people in Dunedin are the highest users of ecstasy. In Whangarei, it's one of the hotspots for meth use.
When it comes to methamphetamine, what we see is either Northland or the Eastern districts are two of the districts which consume more per capita than most of the others.
People living in poor neighbourhoods are 7 times more likely to use amphetamines than those in the wealthy areas. That's no accident, according to a report on meth harm and rehabilitation that was done for the Ministry of Health. That report said that organised crime groups sell meth using strategies similar to multi-level marketing schemes. Meth users become meth sellers to fund their habit. They eradicate the competition from other drugs like cannabis. They give away free product samples like a corporate might, and they give batches of meth appealing names like Pink Champagne.
We are aware that sadly gangs will target areas that are socially deprived, so they can come into a small community where there is limited opportunity, limited education, limited incomes, and effectively take over and influence that community and actually drive levels of addiction.
Richard Dick of the Salvation Army noticed it when he moved from Auckland to Whangarei.
It looks like homelessness, it looks like desperation, it looks like people not having enough to live on, and then you add methamphetamine addiction to that too, and it's just a desperate situation.
Some of the people he sees have been locked up several times, prosecuted rather than treated.
And it doesn't address the problem, maybe even makes it worse, you know, and they just become more alienated from society in general, really, and don't get an opportunity, because we know treatment works. You know, like in my journeys, I've followed a lot of those people and I've seen amazing changes in people, and so when you see people come out the other side of it and they become functioning members of society and, you know, carry on normal general lives that everyone else does. So it's, you know, people weren't born addicts. They weren't born that way.
Families are often blindsided when their kids fall into addiction, and the impact goes well beyond just the user.
It's a horrible journey. It's a horrible journey for the addict, and it's a horrible journey for the addict's family.
Anwin's son started experimenting with drugs at 13, and by 16, he was in serious trouble.
And I was scared. I didn't know what to do. Who do you go to and ask? Who do you go to and say, I'm scared about my child, what should I do?
He was in trouble with the law, but also with the drug suppliers.
You know, there were death threats and things that you don't know how to cope with any of that.
Anwin says there was no help available.
2 occasions I took him to A&E, and on a 3rd occasion he was taken there in an ambulance. And there's no facilities available. You know, there's a lot of talk. You know, what would you like? Like rehab, like psychological help, like some family support. You have to wait 6, 9, 12 months.
And what about her? Eventually she was asked that question.
There was a lovely lady there, which I believe she still works at the hospital, and she just looked at me and she said, "Are you okay?" And I wasn't okay. But nobody had actually asked me that in all these years and at other trips to the hospital. I just said, "No, I'm not okay." She said, "Here's where you can get some help." Wow, I rang that number the next day, and that was the Salvation Army, and it was the Bridge program, and they offered me the 5-step program.
The 5-step program is one of those offered in Whangarei by Richard Dick at the Salvation Army.
Over time they find they might become victims or a type of hostage from their family member, and it's bewildering for them because that's someone that they love, of course, so you know they're in some desperate situations and can't understand it. So that's the 5-step method, really, is a service that offers some information around what's happening to their family member and some strategies to cope with what's happening in their family.
In Mike's situation, he was so caught up in the meth world that he couldn't even see what was happening with his family.
I didn't see it when I was smoking it and selling it, like hurting the community, my family members. But I wasn't looking at that side, I was just looking at making money for me to supply my own meth.
Mike did the Matrix drug rehab program and managed to stop using meth, but this is not an easy thing to give up.
How addictive is meth?
It's like eating lollies.
How do you mean?
Yeah. You like lollies?
Yeah. You want another one?
Exactly. You always want another one. You get the first one and you go, I need another one.
It's not enough.
Not enough.
That might sound like a flippant analogy, but there's some science behind it.
So let's say if you eat your favourite food, like your favourite pavlova, and you think, wow, that was just, that was a buzz, that was like really, really enjoyable. Your brain's actually releasing dopamine. And so the amount of units that your brain is releasing for like your favourite pavlova is 50 units of dopamine. If you use meth, your brain is releasing 1,200 units of dopamine.
Charmaine says when people stop using meth, the brain goes into storage and survival mode, a bit like a level 4 COVID lockdown.
That's kind of what the brain is doing when it's releasing such huge amounts of dopamine over a long period of time, and a lot of our clients have been using meth for maybe 10, 20, 30 years on average before they come to see us. The brain kind of takes that opportunity to have a bit of a rest, and it goes, right, okay, I'm kind of going to do a lockdown here.
At that stage, many of her clients face depression and the urge to go back to drugs. In fact, Charmaine became an alcohol and drug clinician after a friend with a drug problem went through the criminal justice system and ended up taking his own life.
So I'm glad for services like this that provide really fantastic support to clients. Totally non-judgmental and just collaborate and very respectful so that clients, you know, feel supported.
And the police, they support the program too. Whangarei Detective Sergeant Shane Pilmer says that from about 2016, police in the far north started seizing larger amounts of meth and realised they were facing a meth-fuelled crime wave in the region. To put it in perspective, only about 40,000 New Zealanders used amphetamines in the last year, and about 9,000 used them once a month or more. But even that tiny market, about 1% of adults, can create a lot of problems.
Communities were screaming out for some help. So that's when police and health got together and thought, okay, well, what can we do?
The answer was Te Aotearoa. It's a partnership between police, the government, mental health and addiction services, community groups and iwi service providers. Police still go after the meth suppliers, but when they get the dealer, they go through their phones and identify the buyers. Then they target the users, not to lock them up, but to offer them a place on a treatment program.
And we'll knock on their door. It'll be a cold call, we'll be dressed in plain clothes, but with our vests on, and pretty much we've got about 2 minutes probably to convince them why we're there, who we are, and that we're actually there to help.
We've only got a narrow window.
Well, yeah, you can see when they come to the door, there's an open door, there's that little bit of apprehension, maybe a little bit of hostility initially, like, why are you here? After a couple of minutes, you can just kind of see the body language change within them, that, you know, the shoulders kind of drop a little bit, that, you know, they're not looking at you from the same lens which they were, and they're listening to what we've got to offer. And, you know, 9 times out of 10, they'll be saying to us, you know, man, we didn't know you did this kind of thing. We didn't know this help was out there. Not every person will accept it, but you sow the seed with them.
Remember, police have the power to arrest these people for buying, possessing and using meth, but they choose a health solution rather than a criminal one.
But what is the benefit of prosecuting them? Aren't we better off trying to help them to get off the drug and to long-term stop them being a drug user and helping them to turn their life around?
Pilmer is ex-drug squad and he's spent a couple of decades in the police. At first, he was sceptical. The old strategy was just to bust the dealers.
Target the supply, and if you target the supply, then that will filter down. But we know that that doesn't happen, because you target one supplier, another one will pop up tomorrow. When I actually started doing the door knocking myself and seeing the response from the people, yeah, it just completely changed my mindset, and, you know, completely sold on it that this is the way going forward.
He's now working with 7 other officers, a significant resource for whangarei, and it's working.
And they also found that for every $1 that was invested was a return of between $3 and $7 back. So, I mean, that's a pretty good investment in our community. You know, it's not, you know, it's not just the user, it's the families as well. To see the user turn their life around and the impact that has on the families, the whānau, the brothers, the sisters, the mothers, the fathers, is awesome.
Remember Jo with the 12 pages of convictions? She's turned her life around too. For her, the turning point was a specialist drug court rather than yet another drug conviction. In the drug courts, the judge oversees a team which works on a treatment and rehab plan for the offender. Now Jo is helping people deal with drug issues and homelessness in a program run from the Merge Cafe in central Auckland.
Merge Community is basically a place where people can come. It's largely for our homeless community. So I have a team of people that have experienced homelessness themselves, and we create pathways for them into employment. So we build work around the people, not the people around the work. Our motto is, when you're ready, we're ready. And we support them on that journey right through to housing.
And you don't expect them to be completely drug-free. It's not like a light switch which goes on and off. You do tolerate some drug use and feel that that's realistic. Is that your, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but is that basically the kaupapa here? Or?
Yeah, so we're, like, our approach is kind of harm minimisation, you know, like we don't ask that, you know, like, that they're abstinents to be able to come into housing. You know, because that doesn't work, you know, like, let's get the housing stable and then we can look at the other parts of wellbeing. Because when you're on the street, it's a survival mode. You're not looking at anything else but surviving. So let's support people into housing and then look at their wellbeing.
And Aaron, the state ward who started sniffing petrol at 7 years old and left school at 13. He's here too, working for Jo.
It's given me hope. It's given me solid foundation, frame of mind, and some loving, giving back.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Who do you get the love from?
From the whānau that I help. Yeah.
How does that make you feel?
Weird, strange. It's been a long time since I've had that sort of warmth in my life. Yeah.
It looks to me like this place gives you quite a sense of purpose.
It does. It's given me hope, strength, and the willingness to help other people. We're actually quite blessed having a place like this. There's a lot of townships in Aotearoa that have nothing, and they're struggling.
What would you think would make the biggest difference in terms of changing our approach? What do we need to change, either in law or attitude, do you think?
I think definitely the stigma, is massive, and we need to change the stereotypes, the stigma, and language is a big part of that. Calling people junkies or, that they're somebody's son, daughter. I had a great upbringing and just one point in my life, it sent me on a different track. And I guess part of that stigma was my own self-stigma because it was illegal and I'd grown up with a policeman as a father. I stigmatised myself and being a drug addict, yeah.
What do you call yourself now?
Joe.
America's public enemy #1 in the United States is drug abuse.
It's 50 years since New Zealand joined the war on drugs. Where do we go from here? Tim McKinnell, the former drug squad detective, now thinks we should decriminalise all drugs, like they're set to do in Canberra.
I think we should be concerned about things like harm, not about how we rate a certain drug because of its social acceptance and the history behind it. If a drug is harmful, then we need to deal with that harm. I don't think criminalising is the way to do that.
And you get the sense that even some in the high levels of the police force think the same, even if they won't quite say so out loud.
And if you look at states like Oregon, and you look at parts of Australia, and obviously Portugal's the obvious one that people have talked about for a long time, where you have a total decriminalisation approach, not just to cannabis but to all drugs. I mean, is that something that New Zealand would pursue?
That's probably one of those questions I can't go anywhere near, Guy, on camera. Yeah, sorry.
Mike has already been locked up for his drug use. He spent nearly 3 years in prison for using and supplying meth. It wasn't jail that cured him, but treatment, healing his physical and mental health. He's a builder now. His boss says he's the one who gets to work half an hour early to try and earn some extra cash. He's making up for lost time, making up for the things he lost in prison.
My kids' birthdays, Christmases with them, getting letters and phone, ringing them up and hearing all about it sort of, hits you in the heart.
Because you can't be there.
Can't be there,
His eyes are open now and he can see how much more there is to life.
Yeah, exactly. Way more to it than smoking meth. Yeah. No, you feel clear and you can actually see.
What would you say to other people who are watching this and are addicted to meth and are using it all the time and don't think that they can stop?
You can do it. If I can, you can. Yeah. You just gotta dig deep. Yeah, dig deep. Think about what's more important to you. Your family, kids. Yeah.
When Mike was using meth, he was also selling meth and there was plenty of money. But now, there's something with far greater value.
When I was on meth, I had everything. Had it all. Yeah. Kids had it all. Whatever they wanted. And they didn't even want that, They really wanted their father. Father's time to be with them, not the money, the toys. They don't want the money. They want their dad. They want to spend time with their dad. And, yeah.